you. I think you're out there somewhere. I would say it's lovely to see all of you, but I can't. So I'm so happy to be here. I'm so honored to be sandwiched between the miracle of Thomas McConkie and the miracle of the solar eclipse. So this is a wonderful opportunity to be with you. I want to talk today about the wonder of creation and the importance that we are awake and aware of the gift of the creation. And I want to start by telling a brief experience that I had where it all started for me in my love for the creation when I was 12 years old in the summer of 1977. My parents sent me to a boys' ranch in Teton Valley, Idaho, Benyon's Boys Ranch, if you have heard of it, but it was a formative and remarkable experience for many reasons, but most importantly because we spent the last 3 days of our month there backpacking in the Tetons, on the Idaho side of the Tetons. And as a 12-year-old, I was a very active boy in the outdoors in Connecticut where I was growing up, but I had never been in the wilderness, properly speaking, and I had never been backpacking before. I had never felt so vulnerable. I had never experienced or heard the sound of mountain water, the smell of pine forests, the sensation of a threatening lightning storm on a high mountain ridge. I remember my hair kind of raising at one point. And I had never experienced that sensation of lying underneath the stars at night, looking up at the canopy of the stars above me and seeing them framed by high pine trees and listening to the lonely wilderness wind blowing through those trees at night. I'd never seen mountain wildflowers before. And I experienced what we know as awe and wonder as a 12-year-old boy, feeling my own smallness, my own insignificance, and realizing that this place long pre-existed me, would long outlast me, and that I was very, very momentary, very small, but that I had the privilege to witness it. That this was a unique form of joy and pleasure in life. I begged for the chance to return the next summer and was able to. I will also say that on that trip we encountered the wall, as it's known, a 2,000-foot precipice. And I'm proud to say I joined the club that urinated off the edge of that cliff. The wind was blowing a little bit, and it wasn't exactly the cleanest exercise, but there was an important ritual to get me into the club, as it were. Now, nobody's thought more beautifully or written more beautifully about that kind of an experience in the wilderness than William Wordsworth, who wrote one of his most beautiful poems about his experience wandering the hills of the Lake District in England. And what he described here is a presence that he experienced as a young boy, a sense sublime of something far more deeply interfused, whose dwelling is the light of setting suns and the round ocean and the living air and the blue sky. And in the mind of man, a motion and a spirit that impels all thinking things, all objects of all thought, and rolls through all things. Wordsworth is describing this potent force, this motion and spirit of divine breath that moves through the creation, that causes life to emerge, that sustains life on this earth, that it sustains our breath, as King Benjamin says, that even allows us to move and have our being on this planet. And of course, in the revelations of Joseph Smith, we understand that that motion and that spirit is the light of Christ, which section 88 tells us is the light of the sun, it is the light of the moon, it is the light of the stars, it is the light that allows us to perceive and look and witness. And it is the light that grants us consciousness, as Wordsworth was describing and is so beautifully described here in section 88. And I'll just pause here to remind you, and we hope that the clouds are clear enough, but if we have the privilege of witnessing the solar eclipse, even if we don't, I hope that you understand that every morning the sun rises, and that every morning it is a miracle. Every evening when the sun sets, it is a miracle. That there is something beautiful and inherently holy about light and about our experience of the elements in this embodied life. And as this revelation describes, as he's trying to help us understand, if there's any way in which we can understand these kingdoms, as he calls them, these realms of nature, whether or not they're perceived telescopically or microscopically, as these verses tell us, any man who hath seen any or the least of these hath seen God moving in his majesty and power. I say unto you, he hath seen him. This is such a remarkable revelation because it tells us that if we, in the great human quest to grow near to God and to see God, Joseph Smith, of course, was so eager for his fellow saints to see God. And what these verses tell us is that God is everywhere evident in the world around us. That we don't have to look very far to see him, but there is, of course, something about the way in which we look that makes the difference. We can't afford to look at nature as backdrop, as objects, as resources only. We have to see it as a kingdom of God, as an evidence of him and his motion and his intelligence and his light. But of course, the verses warn us, or at least acknowledge the fact that most of us don't comprehend the light. We don't see what he is offering to us as an opportunity to witness, and that deep joy that can come from that experience. Now, no writer, in my opinion, has ever articulated more beautifully the challenge of seeing the natural world in a way that opens us up, as those verses and as Wordsworth described, than Annie Dillard in her wonderful book, Pilgrim at Tinker Creek. Annie Dillard is stalking God. She is trying to find him in the natural world, but there's something important about the way she does it. She's not interested in finding evidence. She's interested instead in what she describes here as being an unscrupulous observer, someone who is not looking for proofs, someone who is not looking with need, but is instead allowing the world to impress itself upon her as if she were the camera, and the light of the world is impressing upon her silver gut, as she puts it here in this beautiful quote. It is a letting go, right, of our ego, of our story, of our thirst and hunger for certain kinds of evidences, and it is instead this letting go. It's the difference, as Robert Frost famously described it, between possessing land and being possessed by it, something he felt Americans had never properly learned. It's the difference between what the famous conservationist Aldo Leopold described as building more roads into lovely countries so that we have more access to more beauty, versus building roads of receptivity into the still unlovely human mind. Leopold is urging upon us a capacity to see beauty that doesn't require us to go to exotic locations. It's the difference that Wallace Stegner made between wanting the desert to look like a garden, and so we technologically engineer it to blossom as a rose, versus letting our eyes open to the blossoming desert. The beautiful geological colors that are available to us in this marvelous state. Now, of course, if we develop this capacity to pay attention, and I'll remind you that Simone Weil famously said that absolutely unmixed attention is prayer. So we're talking about a capacity to see that is a form of reverence and a form of worship. And if we have this capacity, of course, we start to notice something very significant. We are a minority on this planet. We know in the biblical account that God commanded Adam and Eve to multiply and replenish. And we know, of course, that God is interested in his children, in his family. But he was particularly interested in sending us here. And he commanded the fowls of the air to multiply and replenish and to fill the air. He commanded the fish to multiply and replenish and to fill the seas. God takes deep pleasure in an earth that is teeming with life. He is interested in what we call biodiversity today. He's interested in human flourishing, and he's interested in the flourishing of all of his creations. There are 10,000 bird species in the world today. There are 50 billion individuals with wings on this planet. There are 390,000 species of plants, over half of which exist in rainforests, which cover only 3% of the Earth's surface. And there are 900,000 species of insects on this planet, fully 1/3 of which are beetles, leading one biologist to quip that if there is a God, he has an inordinate fondness for beetles. They make up fully 25% of describable animal life on the earth. And what I love about that quote, and the biologist, by the way, was an atheist, he was an unscrupulous advisor. He had no preconceptions of who God would be, but as he looked at the natural world, it seemed to him that God was up to something very strange if he existed at all. And Annie Dillard, like I said, was asking similar kinds of questions. 99% of all living forms on this earth went extinct before human beings even showed up. So it's a fair question to ask, what is God up to? What kind of a God is it who is interested in so much diversity of life over such long periods of time? He seems to stop at nothing. And these facts of the world, just the diversity alone, have often made human beings feel rather threatened. And Christians in particular have not been very good at responding to the facts of the natural world as Christian faith, I think, would require. And maybe that's because a lot of the facts of science make us feel so small and insignificant, and we wonder if we're still special, if God's love is still available to us, that if it was just a human fantasy to believe that we were so important to God. Christians, of course, have historically struggled with the idea of biodiversity because God creates human beings in his image, and we have this exceptional identity as children of God. And so the assumption maybe was, we don't need to care about the animal kingdom. We don't need to worry about plants. But in the restored gospel, plants and animals are living souls. And Joseph Smith taught us clearly that all living things have a right to joy in their posterity. Again, God is interested in the flourishing of all life. Everything is intended to fulfill the measure of its creation, as we learn in the restored accounts of the creation. We also know that Christians have historically struggled with the temporal scale that science now tells us is the scale in which life has evolved, not only on this planet, but on the earth. That the earth is not 6,000 years old, but 4.5 billion years old. That the universe is 13.4 billion years old. And that it is hard for us to understand how a creation presumably happened within 6 days, and that the earth is only 6,000 years old. But in the restored accounts of the creation, this temporal scale problem vanishes. We're told that there were creative periods that allowed the creation to come forward, not literal days. So this should also not bother us. We're also told that the spatial scale of the creation is something that maybe created problems historically for Christians, right? Christians historically believed for many centuries that the earth was the center of the universe. And then, of course, Copernicus and Galileo helped to debunk that idea that the center of the universe was the sun, not the earth. And then, of course, we found out that the solar system wasn't the center of anything at all. There is no center to the universe. In this expansive universe of many worlds, what is in the restored gospel, worlds without number that Moses witnesses in the restored account of the creation in the book of Moses. And what does he discover? He discovers that man is nothing, which thing he never had supposed. He is overwhelmed by awe and wonder. It is important for us to ask ourselves, what was the purpose of that experience of collapsing? And one of the things that I think is meaningful about that story is that it is his unique human privilege and capacity to take it in, to witness it. Unlike all other living things on the planet, human beings have that uniquely developed capacity of awe and wonder and contemplation of things larger than ourselves, much larger than ourselves, but we still struggle to have that experience. It is important to recognize, of course, that Christians also have struggled with even caring about physical life because the creation is itself a curse, right? That we were fallen into this fallen world, that the life of the body is a time of suffering. It's something to get through, the veil of tears that we hope to escape from in order to return to a blissful spiritual existence outside of the body and outside of this earth. Restored accounts tell a very different story. This life is a blessing, that the union of body and spirit is the highest state of humankind and the highest state of divinity. And that this earth is not the way station that we're striving to get out of in order to get to some better place. This is the site of the celestial kingdom. This is the place that we are striving to earn the right where we can stay put. Finally, Christians have struggled with the story of evolution for lots of reasons, not the least of which is the problem of a universe of a creation in which physical matter seems to have autonomy and unpredictability that traditional conceptions of God's omnipotence can't accommodate. But in the restored accounts of the creation, God is not this magician who speaks and everything comes into being out of nothing. He is instead an artist whose spirit breathes over deep water, chaotic material, unorganized matter, and partners with chaos in order to bring forth life, making much more room. So we do not need to wonder about the vastness of the creation and wonder if that means that somehow God's love is not available to us. We do not need to consider that a problem. As Latter-day Saints, my conviction is that we should embrace the findings of science. That doesn't mean, of course, that everything is reconcilable all the time. As President Nelson said, if it seems that science and religion are offering different accounts of reality, either our understanding of science needs to change or our understanding of religion needs to change, or both. Because the restored gospel embraces truth of all kinds. That is one of the most exciting principles of our doctrine. So it is important, and this is a new slide. I didn't know this was going to appear on my slides, but look at this. This is an opportunity for us science is presenting us an opportunity to explore wonder, okay? And if it makes us worry that maybe we're somehow so small that God can't find us in all of that expansiveness, Jesus taught us that not one single sparrow falls without God noticing. Not one single sparrow. Well, guess what? The bad news is lots of sparrows are falling. Lots of birds are declining in population numbers across the planet. Bees are declining. Animals of all kinds are threatened. We have entered the 6th mass extinction on the Earth's history. And the 6th extinction, unlike the previous 5, is human-caused. And it is happening at a rate much, much greater than those previous mass extinctions. This is a serious problem. Another serious problem that is related, of course, is that since the Industrial Revolution, we have been emitting more and more carbon into our atmosphere, which is intensifying the greenhouse gas effects of our atmosphere, warming the planet at rates far beyond natural patterns. And this is causing seas to rise. This is causing plants and animals to be more threatened. And this is causing glaciers to melt. This is threatening plant and animal life, and it is threatening human life. And you and I in this room, most of us will be able to adapt to the conditions of a changing climate. We already are. But the world's poor will not have that liberty. Those people who rely on the immediate environmental conditions of their world are seriously threatened. My wife and my son and I traveled to Ecuador a number of years ago, and we were brought to a high mountain village of an indigenous community. And on the drive, we were talking about climate change, and they wanted to know what they could do to deal with this problem. And as we were talking, I explained to them that some people in my country didn't believe it was a problem. They didn't even believe it was happening. And I'll never forget the sound of utter confusion in their voice. How is it possible that people don't realize what's going on? Because, of course, their livelihood depended on the rainfall and on the environmental conditions of where they lived. So when Jesus commands us to care for the least of these, I hope we're considering the impacts that our decisions in a fossil fuel economy are the impacts that it will have on the poor. From the way we transport ourselves, how we clothe ourselves, how we shelter ourselves, how we feed ourselves, all the things that we do in a fossil fuel economy are contributing to this emission of carbon into the atmosphere that is compromising the Earth's capacity to regulate the climate as it has done miraculously for the past 15,000 years that have allowed conditions to allow human civilization to flourish. Now, if it's hard for us to imagine our impact on the poor, let me ask you to think about your own posterity. This young boy, our first grandchild, was a COVID gift. He was born in 2020. He will be 80 years old in 2100. And so when we look at all of the climate predictions, the differences between 2, 4, 6, 8 degrees 80 years from now disproportionately affects our future generations who have no voice in our democracy today. He and his sister have sat on the laps of their great-grandparents. These are my parents who were born in the 1930s. So if he and his sister live to be in their 80s, they will hold great-grandchildren on their laps in the year 2100, and those children will live presumably to the year 2180. So what I want you to think about is that each of us represents a span of about 250 years of generations of humanity that have touched each other. That you and I sat on the laps of our ancestors, and our descendants will sit on the laps of their descendants. All right, I think I got that backwards, but anyway, you get my point. So my point is this: what difference does it make in terms of how we live if we have this sense of connection to the past, but more importantly, as the prophecies of Malachi that we talk so much about in the church, we rarely talk about the second half, Our hearts are turned towards our fathers and mothers, but they should be turned toward our children. They should be turned towards future generations. And our stewardship is for the flourishing of all life on the planet, both human and more than human. I have studied religion and the environment for 20 years, and I have never found such remarkable doctrines of stewardship as we have in the restored gospel. They're exceptional. So my plea today is let's be exceptional leaders of environmental stewardship. Let's let our light shine and let the world know that Latter-day Saints care about God's creations. These verses remind us of the importance of living with judgment, consuming with care, not to excess, neither by extortion, but they also recognize the gifts of the creation to help us in our lives. I get it that environmental problems are polarized, they're politicized, but you and I need to be guided by our theology, not by our political ideologies. At their root, environmental problems are a symptom of a moral failure. They are a symptom of greed. They are a symptom of self-centeredness, a symptom of a narrow self-interest that guides most of our behavior. And there's no room for that in the restored gospel. I will also point you to the idea that in the restored gospel, Jesus Christ suffers, dies, and resurrects not only for our sins, but for our pains, afflictions, our weaknesses, our sorrows that are biological. But it's even more than that. He suffers, he dies, and he resurrects for the suffering and the living creatures of all of creation. So if we want to know something about the heart and mind of the Creator, we need to love what he loves. Every sparrow, every beetle, every wildflower. And we need to understand what kind of a God he is. This is not limiting our ability to love other human beings. It is an expansion of our ability to love. Now, there's one thing I didn't tell you about the Tetons, and that is that I have gone back to that hike many times. Those photos were taken on a pilgrimage with my wife. When I was 18 years old, I lost my brother to a suicide. And my opportunity arose. I don't remember how it got created, but I wanted so badly to go back to the Tetons. And I hiked that trail with young boys and showed them the wonders of the wilderness. And I was broken. But in my brokenness, I felt a healing happening to me in the natural world, as if nature itself was absorbing my grief. I felt the powers of the atonement, that motion and that spirit moving through the creation is God's healing power. We all know this is true because we've seen it happen in our lives and the lives of others, that you get outside and you experience nature and you stop thinking about your own story. This is what God had to explain in the longest speech by God the Father in all of Scripture to Job, who had good reason to say, my story is awful. And God says, have you looked at the whales? Have you paid any attention to the mountains? Do you know anything about glaciers? Do you know anything at all about stars? If we open our eyes to the creation, the atoning and healing powers of Christ's love are available to all of us. I can only say to you as a personal witness that in my work in caring for the environment, my community has grown, my sense of belonging is larger, my sense of love is bigger. It has been an enormous blessing in my life, and I commend it to you that we can all be better stewards of the environment. Thank you so much. Mm-hmm.